Okay, here we go. Back with the podcast today. And Sinead joins me today. Sinead is an executive performance advisor. Now, we met on LinkedIn fairly recently, actually. And, having a conversation really resonated with her message and how she helps leaders. So we talked about a few different subjects that we could go into. And this one, I think, resonated for us both. It's something that I talk a lot about in my content and I'm really passionate about. And actually, it's the opening, aspect of my own program, which is these patterns that are revealed under pressure. Now, if you're a leader, you'll know all about pressure. And I always say it's not about avoiding pressure. It's about learning to respond to pressure in a conscious way. So we're going to go into the different patterns that reveal themselves under pressure. And we're going to talk a little bit about how they're formed and what we can do when these patterns come to the surface, because they're always going to be there. I wrote a post this week about coming back from holiday and, slipping a bit in my regulation practices. And I noticed these old patterns coming to the surface. So they're always there. They're always waiting to come to the surface. And, what can we do when they come to the surface? How can we maintain our regulation when we're under the pressure of, particularly in leadership roles for our work and also in our home life as well? So lots to go into today. But first of all, welcome, Sinead. Great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Mark.
So, as it's your first time on the podcast, let's go into a little bit about your background. What led you to this work in particular, and why you're so passionate about it, and what in particular about this subject we're going to talk about today? Wherever you'd like to start, really, in your own background story.
Yeah, so for me, I've always wanted to help people. Fundamentally, as a 16-year-old girl, I popped into the career guidance office and he advised me that I should do dietetics based on a series of questions. So it ticked that box. I needed to help people. So I went to pursue ultimately a career in dietetics. However, I had to shadow dietitian as part of that postgraduate application for the UK universities. I did that in an oncology-based paediatric hospital in Ireland. And what I saw in that environment will live with me forever. And I had this gut-wrenching moment where I realized a dietitian will always work with someone who was a clinical presentation. And I knew I needed to get to people before they got sick. So I went back to my final year of the undergraduate degree that I was doing in nutritional science, knocked on the door of the researchers that I was working with and asked about research opportunities. And it led me to my PhD journey, where I focused on nutrition and inflammation. And it was incredible. And I was in a very prestigious university and learning everything, but it got very isolated and I couldn't live paycheck to paycheck in a way. It was grant applications. I wanted a little bit more security. So I pivoted into the corporate world and had an incredible career, but I was never taught how to manage or lead myself. All I knew was to show how to show up for everyone else. So ultimately due to a new role, getting stuck in, I just put in the hours. It was relentless, 80 hours plus anywhere from a 15 to 20 hour commute on top of it every week was my life. And I didn't know how to stop that. And then I had personal demands on top of it. So I found myself collapsed in our bedroom in 2016. My now husband walked in and just saw me in the fetal position, uncontrollably crying. And he didn't know what to do, didn't recognize me. He called his father, who was living in Belgium at the time, and he was like, take the mobile phone out of her hand and take her outside. And that's what we did. And I went to bed that night and I got up and I did the same thing. I didn't have the language about what was happening in 2016. And I just continued to do what I did. And, lots of uncomfortable conversations with my husband over the years, lots of cold dinners, lots of missed events. And he kept saying to me, Sinead, you're doing this to yourself. And I just couldn't figure it out, Mark. And I just did what I knew. And I know there was so much shame admitting that I just couldn't cope. I was surviving. But at work, I was absolutely on fire.
Yes.
And one of my biggest goals was to get to the United States. It was part of this secondment program with the company. And it's something you don't apply for. You make your interest known and then you're selected. And that came in 2019. I was selected to go represent the company in the US. And I just continued to do what I did. And due to COVID, it got paused. I was supposed to leave June 2020. It got paused. And then we did depart for the US in January 2022. And this time it was different, Mark, because when I landed in the United States, in the town we were to base ourselves in, the company took me 3 hours away to do my training. So immediately, both Dave, my husband, and I were separated, relocating. And every evening we were home in separate houses in Ireland. No one was available to my phone calls because it was 5 hours ahead. They were already asleep in bed and unavailable. And all the things that I love to do started to disappear. So, I would have been interested in getting up and doing some mindful work. I'd batch cook food so that I'd nourishing food throughout the day. And it all just slipped away. And I became really snappy, like just at work, you wouldn't have seen that. But at home, I was snappy. And I remember Dave turning around to me after about 3 months of this. And he was like, I think I'll go back to Ireland. I can't do this anymore. And he said it in a really calm way. And to me, that was failure. I was like, no, like, we have to continue this. We have to find a way to make this work. And I was like, give me 6 months. Well, I said, give me till the 1st of June, 2022, and we'll figure it out. And if it doesn't work, then we'll go back and revisit the conversation. And I made a commitment that every evening I'd come home. So my training was done. I was now living in the same town with Dave. And what I did was I literally went to the kitchen, I batch cooked. So in the evenings, I wasn't spending, an hour prepping food. It was just the meals were ready and we could spend time together, whether that was going exploring somewhere new, whether it was going for a walk together. So we started to reconnect after a bit of disconnection for a number of months. And then I promised him that I would come home at the time that I said. So if it was 5 o'clock, I would never, whatever the work was, it just stopped. And the other thing that I promised was that we would do something incredibly fun once a month. So that first thing was Montreal. We went up to Montreal and had a great weekend. And we both agreed if we continued that commitment for the rest of the duration, we would get through the 3 years. So, and I didn't know, but Mark, within 3 weeks of me really knuckling down to batch cooking, prioritizing connection with Dave, prioritizing fun at least once a month. And then I started to have the energy to do the things that I loved. All of a sudden, I was able to get up in the morning and exercise. I was able to perform and be the leader to the teams that I knew I could be. But I was just, I suppose I was hesitant. I was fearful. Things that I now realize on retrospect that I was firing on all cylinders, but I wasn't the best I could be. And I incorporated a lot of these practices, but they disappeared. And then I started to go, what's actually happening in the body, when this is happening? And when I understood the impact of stress physiology in the body, and that's what overtook, that was running the show. My nervous system was completely stuck. And it was just a cortisol. And I wore coffee like a badge of honor. And I'm not proud to say it, but I was drinking surplus of 10 cups of coffee a day. And I just added fuel to the fire. Coffee is good in moderation, but not at the volume that I was drinking it. And all of these signs, I just never realized how much the physiology was involved in everything that we did. And I just knew towards the end of our time in the United States, they moved me 3 hours away again. So I was a bit annoyed driving around upstate New York, beautiful part of the world, but I wanted to be at home with the friends that we had made, became our family. That's where I wanted to be for the final 3 months. And I promised myself, because I could feel the frustration, the anger, resentment, a lot of I suppose feelings came up towards corporate and the environment. And I was like, I'll never get out from under this. And I just have witnessed so many leaders, so many people with responsibilities are leaders, parents, teachers, coaches. The minute you have a responsibility, you're a leader, and you carry that stress, you carry that with you. And I've witnessed so many, including myself, have illnesses as a result of stress. And a lot of them have turned around to me and said that cardiac event, that cancer, was the result of stress. And those chronic disorders, those chronic diseases are happening so much earlier in life, and it doesn't have to be that way. And as a result of that, I've made it my mission to educate people on what stress physiology is, and it's trainable. And that's the thing that really excites me. It's a practice like a language. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. It's not a one and done. You have to practice, and you don't have to wait for the weekend. You don't have to wait. Because the reality is there is no restorative. You need in the day, there is so many ways that you can recover to allow you to buffer cortisol, which is the primary stress hormone that has a lot of effects in the body. So it goes full circle. At 16, I wanted to help people. And through my lived experiences of, studying nutrition and inflammation at a very in-depth level, and now, I was educated and I still messed up. I didn't know how to apply it to me. And gosh, the leader I could have been had I known what I know now. And yeah, it's really, I suppose my passion is, we don't need to see, it says it on my LinkedIn header, it's my banner, it's like leadership shouldn't cost you your health. And it's an occupational constant. And in my opinion, it's getting more and more pressurized. The pace of life, so the pressure is building. It's becoming more and more important that we talk about this, Mark, and hence the reason why we really connected on this level. So that's my background and my story as to how I got into this really important business that I've created.
Wow. What a story. You articulated so well. And I hope anyone listening to that, if you're resonating with that, I mean, this is such a common pattern in leadership. And it's tempting to think, isn't it? Like you said there, well, I wish I'd known back then what I know now. I'm the same, but it almost seems like you have to, I'm always saying this, like it seems you have to hit a wall, or you have to collapse in order to change your way of working, your way of living. It seems to be built into the gym. Like everyone I speak to has had a collapse, a burnout, mental health challenges, relationship breakups. It just seems to be almost par for the course, And I think certainly from my experience, the people that I work with, if we don't have that, then the tendency is we just run the pattern. We can just run our pattern our whole lives. And if we don't hit a wall, then we won't realize the error of our ways until the end, until, like you said, there's some kind of physical disease that overwhelms us, and that's it. So it's almost like you're fortunate to have this kind of, to hit a wall midlife, to do something about it. If it happens later in life, like I said, you can pick up some kind of illness, and that can be that. But what would you? So I know there's 5 particular leadership pressure. I like the way you define leadership, by the way. It isn't just about you're managing a team in corporate, or you're building a business. Any responsibility makes you a leader. So if you're a parent, you're a leader. But also, even beyond that, leading yourself, which is the most important aspect of leadership. I'm always saying, if you don't know how to lead yourself, then it's very difficult to lead anybody else, in terms of your own inner world, like the awareness of what's happening internally, the ability to regulate yourself emotionally, the ability to listen to your thoughts instead of getting caught up in them. That's where leadership starts, really. But what I want to ask is, there's numerous pressure patterns. What would you say now what would you call that default pattern that you fell into, or, is under the surface, or is most predominant for you now? Because I have a certain word for that particular pattern that you've talked about there. What would you call it?
So for me, for years, I would have been flight. Okay.
Yeah.
I call it like a flight, where I'm constantly avoiding and I call the word pottering. If the house is clean, Mark, I know I'm in flight. I'm avoiding what I really need to do. But really and truly, during my corporate, so I was flight really and truly during my academic time. But in the corporate world, I became a fawn. I said yes. I people
Right.
pleased. I was easygoing, really and truly, until I had to find a way to speak up, because after Q4 of 2016, and I was January, February, I was like, I cannot continue in this world. I need to speak up. And part of that was the relationship with my direct leader, and through a lot of support from my husband, who, as he would say, gave me the backbone that I needed to be able to speak. But it took a lot of preparation. So I definitely was a default phoner. What would you call it, Mark?
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, that is my underlying pattern. You call it flight, I call it the avoider, which is basically under pressure, you check out. That was always my pattern. If there's a challenging situation that's coming up in work, and I need to speak to one of my team members, I would avoid it. Likewise, that's how my challenge, I've talked about my mental health challenges in the past. It was because I would kind of check out of what's happening within my body and go up to the head and start, thinking about it. There are always gifts to every pattern. Mm-hmm. The predominant pattern that I work with most with people is that pleaser pattern, which is the, you talked about there, which is prioritizing other people's needs above your own. So you'll always be in a place, energetically, you'll always be depleted if you're running that pattern, because everybody else comes first, whether that's your spouse or your children or your team or your manager. So you're never prioritizing yourself, always putting other needs first. It's interesting because when you were talking there, the pattern that felt most resonant for me, which is what I call the controller. Now, I'm not sure what you might have another term for this, but I'm just going through them now because I've got a whole module on this in my program. The need to maintain control to avoid emotional chaos or pain, focus on perfection, logic, a way to control or manage emotions, prioritizing structure over spontaneity. And the thing with this pattern is they are absolutely outstanding in a work environment, holding everything together. But they judge everything and everyone by performance. So they judge themselves by performance. If you're not performing at a high level, they come down on themselves really hard. Likewise, if other people aren't performing at a high level, they come down on them really hard. But it's this, they're a gift to every pattern, but they're absolutely outstanding in work environment. But then in a home environment, that's where it can kind of show up. And this idea that it's all about structure. So under pressure, it's very much, they focus in and they go, they really want to perform highly in their work and everything is very organized. But then they struggle for the fun and the spontaneity side of life, which is something that you seem to notice and start to integrate. So did you have a word for that particular pattern?
Well, I call that fight, it's
fight. There you go.
Driven in the sense of, you need to do what you need to do. And I go into overdrive. Don't get me wrong. I always say you have a predominant default, but you move among, depending on different situations. And I'm definitely a driver at times. But when I really and truly started to do some work in regards to understanding my stress language, I just went, oh God, that inner child, because it is from childhood traumas and different events, micro traumas that led to me being the way I am. I went, oh God, I've been fighting the wrong language here. I'm actually a fawn. And I had to turn around, Mark, earlier this year as I started to grow my business. I overcommitted. My default is like, I don't want to say no to this person. It still exists within me. It's my default. All I want to do is say yes, 3 packs full. It's my default. But I absolutely recognize that at times I go into that overdrive fight. Let's go to get it done. I need to know everything that's going on. Keep me informed to the point that I'm exhausted. But the inner child in me is fawning for sure.
Yes, so well said. Well, I'll tell you what. We'll go into the key to freeing ourselves from these patterns as we go. But let's just go through the other patterns then, because I just want anyone who's listening now, watching now, maybe you can identify with one or more of these patterns. Because like you said, there tends to be one or two that's most dominant, but we run them all really. But what I would say to people is, it doesn't mean that you are this pattern. when you've done enough of this kind of inner work, which I know a lot of people will have done watching this, you can understand that who you are is the witness or the awareness of the pattern. But the problem is most people aren't aware of who they really are, and so they're lost in the pattern completely. When you start to become aware of the pattern, you can witness the thoughts and the emotions in your body in particular. That's when you can start to free yourself. So we'll talk more about that. But the important thing is this is just a pattern. This is like the software that's running on your laptop. Basically, it's not you're like the hardware, if you like. This is just the software that you've incorporated as you go through life. As I said, it's often as a result, as you said, it's often a result of, when we're children, we develop strategies to deal with intense situations, intense energy when it hits our system. Sometimes we push it outwards, sometimes we push it onto others, sometimes we push it downwards. But I'll just quickly go through these 5 patterns in particular. And if you want to chip in at any point, Sinead, just let me know. So we touched on a couple of these. The avoider, which is what I call it. I know you have no name for it, Sinead, but this is when I read about this, I was like, wow, that's me down to a T. But what we call the air element in the lineage that I learned from. So it's escaping overwhelming emotions by mentally or energetically leaving their body. This is what I did. And it leaves you vulnerable to particular mental health challenges because you're always checking out into your imagination under stress. So it's very difficult to stay in the body because you don't feel safe. It's like, imagine like a squirrel when it comes down out of the tree onto the ground. It's always on alert. And as soon as anything, a twig snaps, back, whoosh, shoots back up into the tree. So this is what you're like energetically. You're always kind of like, never feel safe in the body, and you're always escaping off into the mind, into different visualizations of realms, etc. The advantage of that is it gives you tremendous realm access, as we say in the kind of spiritual community, a tremendous access to intuition and your spiritual side. So that's the kind of like that's my gift. But the shadow side is that it's very difficult to stay grounded in your body. A lot of work required then to start reconnecting with your body and feeling safe within your own body. So that's the first one. The second one, which I see more than any other of the people I work with, and you've talked about this as well, which is what I call the pleaser, which is fawn. I know you talked about. So this is the classic people pleaser. As I said, needs were not fully met, causing them to rely on others for security and validation. So it's always under stress, under pressure. It's always wanting to merge with another human being, basically, to share the energy, share the pressure with another person. So seeking connection to feel whole, but struggling with boundaries and independence. So this is that is why boundaries become so important, and the ability to put themselves first. But the gift in that particular pattern is they're incredible in roles that require nurturing. So, for example, my wife runs this pattern, and she's a therapist, speech and language therapist. She's fantastic in that role, but the shadow side often is that she'll, approach burnout at times because she's always putting the needs of her clients first or her team members first, whatever it might be. So that's the classic pattern. So let's quickly go through this. The other one, which we haven't talked about, is what I call the suppressor. So this is the pattern of under pressure, all the energy goes down, pushed down towards the ground within themselves. This kind of person, you may notice in a team environment, is extremely reliable in challenging situations, but what they don't do is talk and speak up when they're under pressure. So it's very much about, I need to deal with this all myself. They're very quiet, they're very reliable, but eventually by pushing all those emotions down within themselves and dealing with all themselves, that you only do that for so long. At some point, something's going to break somewhere. It often shows up as mental or physical health problems. But, feelings of resentment, even physical illness, when these unexpressed emotions just build up. So they tend to be very quiet and deal with everything themselves, but never speak up and ask for help. 2 more. I think you called this the fight, but I call this the dominator. Now, this is particularly prominent in leadership positions. Think of all the great charismatic leaders. They're often running this, what I call fire pattern, the dominator. So they're extremely good at expressing themselves. They're extremely natural leaders. They inspire people to follow them. think about, the classic leaders in politics, for example. You often see this pattern. So that's the positive side of it. The negative side is they often suppress others in a need to control them. So they're very domineering, and that can often suppress those around them. So we all know this pattern, not a particularly nice pattern to work with day to day, I have to say, in my experience. But there are certain gifts with that pattern. And always with these patterns, it's about, can you heal the shadow side and to leave yourself with the gift? That's what we're always working through with these patterns. The last one,
love that.
the controller, which I've talked about, which is something that I kind of felt a little bit in your story, which is the outstanding at work. The energy tends to go up into the head, and they're very much about controlling their environment and everyone around them, and everything is about performance. But often that doesn't leave much room for fun and spontaneity and taking a day off, as you said, just to explore, or just a day off to rest and recover, because everything is judged by performance. If they're not performing, there's a feeling of guilt or shame, whatever it might be under the surface that they're avoiding. But those are the 5 in particular that I'm aware of. Anything you would say about those, Sinead, in your experience that I've missed, or any extra comments?
So especially when you were describing the one, the one around where you're pushing those feelings down, it's very into the ground.
Suppressor.
I would very much see that in the workspace as someone, I could describe them like they freeze in a way, and they will not speak up, and people might see them as lazy in that instance because they're not contributing, or there's a lot of indecision, and but that's just their, and what I call them is languages. We all have a default stress response, like we speak English, Spanish, Chinese, whatever we speak, we all have a default. And when you understand that, like you were just describing, one, you're able to support yourself for self-leadership and self-care. But number 2, you get to see it in the others. And I was just having a conversation this morning, supporting with someone who's what I describe a fawner. Her boss is absolutely, like you described, that person who's controlling, quite dominant, you could say, in both instances, and having a terrible time at work, just as looking at leaving. And even by me conversing with her and saying, you have a stress language, I think it's this. Your employer has a stress language, I think it's this. And it's very hard to have a conversation because your nervous system is trying to protect you from this dominant person. And I could see a weight lift from her in that. And it was just about creating that space. Then how does she have this conversation with this person who is dominant, and they don't probably even know it themselves? And it just creates this whole, that's the important thing, is building this awareness so that we can have these appropriate conversations, because there's always conflict. We're all different, and we just need to be comfortable with having those conversations and giving people the support to be able to, one, look after themselves, to be able to step into that, create enough safety in themselves so that they can step in and have that conversation. Because that's what's holding us back, is our nervous system has got us in this protect mode, and we can't speak up. And that's really what I look to support, guide people in those steps, to be able to recognize their language, and that of their colleagues, and especially their direct leader, which has the most impact in people's lives. I smile, Mark, often, you see it on LinkedIn, the toxic boss, and I'm like, that's a person. People are people, and they're all going through their own stuff, and they've learned through learned behaviors, this is how you respond in a stressful situation. And they come across aggressive, arrogant, rude, every word you can think of, but they're a person carrying their own emotional, cognitive, logistical load. And if you see them that way, you can start to break down, okay, how should I approach this person in regards to having this conversation? One, the person might respond in a way that surprises you by going, gosh, I didn't realize that was happening, and open to that dialogue. The other, they might dismiss it. Or third, they might go away and think about it. And imagine if it was the first scenario, they were open to it. Imagine your life by having that conversation. And it just awakens that, it creates that psychological safety, as I call it, physiological safety as well within them, to allow them to even contemplate that conversation. Because ultimately they're
Yes.
going to depart that work environment at some point, maybe not in the right immediate future, but they'll never regret having said something, but they'll regret it for a long time by not saying anything.
Yeah, very well said. It's I like what you say there, because compassion really comes up for me in that, because what we're talking about here, as we said earlier, it's an inner child version of themselves that has learnt this pattern in order to survive. So you can imagine what the environment at home would have been like for someone like, I'm going to use a classic fire pattern, Donald Trump, for example. He just seems, he immediately springs to mind, and he causes so much division. Some people love him, some people absolutely hate him. But just imagine the environment that child grew up in to develop that kind of pattern to that extent, and to survive basically the energetic input that was coming at him at that point. So there's always space for compassion. And as you said, what I want to talk about now is the awareness is the first point. You've got to understand your pattern, and also, like, I love what you said there, the patterns of those around you as well is really important to understand why they're running that pattern, the gifts of that pattern, how to approach that pattern, how to unlock that pattern. Now, you can't make a certain person do the work on themselves to heal that pattern. That they have to come to that realization themselves when they're ready. But what you can do, as you said, is start to work on yourself to free yourself from that pattern. Because the reason I like the using the elements with these patterns, we talk about the dominator being like the fire energy, and the lever, my pattern, being the energy of air. So what happens when fire meets air? It explodes, basically. So that was the pattern that I always had the most problem with. I would meet that fire pattern, that controller in the work environment, and I would just shoot into my pattern, the lever pattern, and I would just leave my body. Basically, I wouldn't know how to respond, and they would just run all over me, basically. And I had no ground in my system to say anything back, basically. So I had all kinds of problems with this pattern in a work environment in particular. But for example, the water pattern, the pleaser, I've always been very comfortable with that pattern. My wife runs that pattern. My parents run that pattern. I've always been around that pattern, and water and air, they tend to work quite well together, and that's why. But in order for me to start to be able to hold my own ground in my body around that fire pattern, I had to start healing myself, which means I had to start finding a way to be comfortable in my own body, to find safety in my own body. And for me, doing this work with lots of people over the years, the key to unlocking and releasing and healing that pattern ultimately is about coming out of the head, which is where many of us live our entire lives, and back into the body. I'm interested to get your thoughts as well on this, Sinead, because I imagine you'll have a similar thoughts on this, because it's when we live in our heads that we are stuck in the pattern, basically. The emotion, the nervous system goes into fight or flight, and immediately the conditioned mind takes over and takes us into this survival mechanism, basically. Because you may notice when you're in a stressful situation, immediately you go up to your head and you start trying to think your way out of it. The way I found to start, first of all, the awareness of that happening. Okay, here I go into the pattern, whatever your pattern is. So important. The first thing is having awareness of when it's taking place, and then the ability to unhook from the pattern. And the way you do that is the way I always teach it, and the way I've always done it, is to notice what's happening in the body. So in what we call the center channel, there's a line of energy centers in there. Don't have to go deep into that today, but if you can find right now, if you're listening or watching this, just take a breath and just see if you can feel into what's happening, particularly in maybe the throat area or the center of the chest, solar plexus, stomach. I mean, if I drop in now, I can feel quite a lot happening in the throat. I can feel a bit of tightening in the solar plexus, a bit of pressure on the stomach, and just locating what's happening in the body. As soon as you do that, you've unhooked yourself from that stress pattern. You've come back to the present moment, awareness of your body. And essentially, you've come back to who you are, which is what you could call awareness, basically, awareness of what's happening, rather than the identifying with the thoughts and emotions. You're able to witness what's happening. As soon as you've done that, you're back in control of what's happening. You're able to choose a conscious response over the unconscious reaction, which is the pattern. So it can take time for people to be able to unhook like that, because when I start working with people, leaders, often there's no access to the felt sense in the body. Like they cannot feel anything in the body because they live in their heads for so long. But over time, you can start to notice, okay, yeah, I can feel a bit of tightening in the stomach. I can feel some pressure on the center of the chest. And that is the beginning of starting to come back to yourself in the present moment, reconnect with the body. And that's your way out of the pattern when it starts to take hold. But I'm interested in your thoughts around that, Sinead, in terms of how you work with a leader to heal or unhook from the unconscious pattern that's running the show.
Yeah. I talk about a lot of the time is I talk about microseconds in the corporate space. You know, if someone said to me, give me 5 minutes, I was like, I don't have 5 minutes for anything. So I talk about the space of microseconds, because in that stillness, in that pause, like you just described, you get to feel things that you never would allow yourself to feel because you're just up here. And I'll give you a really great live example of what happened to me a couple of weeks ago. Got a phone call for this workshop I was delivering. And that phone call informed me that I was at the wrong location. Well, you can imagine the stress that immediately sent me into, there's a lot of proverbials in my head, but I went, oh God. And, you know, stress is great. In that moment, I needed acute stress to get me in the car, to get to the location safely, obviously. But once the adrenaline, the cortisol had worn off, in the car, when I was driving to that location, I was in my head, absolutely in my head. And it was like a stick to beat myself with. All those automatic negative thoughts just into my head. And I could feel my heart racing. And because I've been doing this long enough, it was just, Sinead, take a moment. And, you know, for me, the physiological sigh is one of the most profound. I didn't realize it, that I sighed all the time. But now that I understand the importance of the physiological sigh to bring down that calmness, because you can't think yourself into calm. You have to give yourself, the body, the right inputs. And, you know, in that 30 seconds of intentional breathing, I was able to realize, okay. And what can you do about it? How can we reframe this? And I started creating a much better narrative. And I didn't go there. I didn't become that fawning, people pleasing, you know. I was like, I'm going to be cancelled. My contract with this, you know, you just catastrophized in that instant. And by the time I got to the correct location, we had a wonderful workshop. But just in that split 30 seconds, and I think the listeners will resonate with, you're at the wrong location, you got the wrong time, everything that's happening in that moment.
Yes. And the important message there, I think, is about being compassionate with ourselves, because no matter how much work you've done, and you like you, Sinead, I've done 10 years of this work now, meditation work and healing work. And there are still plenty of times where I find myself getting caught in unconscious reactions. But the way I look at it now is that and it is so important to make these integrate daily practices, and we can talk about how to do that before we finish today. The way I look at it now is like, the more you commit to these daily practices, the faster you realize and catch when you've got lost in the pattern. Initially, you might find half an hour goes by, things start to calm down. You realize, oh, damn, I went into the people pleaser pattern, or the controller pattern, or the leaver pattern. And, you know, it tends to do a lot of damage when you do that. And then, you know, obviously about, you know, trying to repair that as best you can. But then over the years, I've noticed I just catch myself quicker. And now it might be just, you know, a couple of minutes before I realize, oh, here I go. The awareness comes back online again. Yep, come back to the body, come back to feel into what's happening. Okay, I'm back in the present moment. I'm back in control of what's happening. But it's important to realize that the pattern will always be there.
Yeah.
And even this week, after a week of neglecting my practices a little bit, being on holiday, I just noticed them coming back to the surface, and it creating relationship tension with my wife and my daughter. So they're always going to be there. But it's so important to commit to the daily practices, so you realize faster and faster when you got caught up into this negative pattern. Before we finish today, I know you've talked about in the moment, which is so important, taking a breath, coming back to the body. Are there any additional daily practices that you recommend, or that you bring into the work with your clients that help them to regulate themselves or to build that self-awareness of what's happening within, like meditation, or do you not focus so much on that?
Oh no, they what I really, for ourselves, if you're able to, do fill your own cup before you start to spill into everyone else's. And, you know, everyone's day looks very different. If you're able to even give yourself 5 minutes to go outside, be in nature, the power of those fractals, just looking at trees and leaves and the sky, the clouds in the sky, it all has very much a calming effect. Going for a walk in nature, doing a bit of mindfulness, meditation. And then in the work day, if it's possible, I bring in, you know, some somatic and sensory exercises that people can do. You know, heel raises are a great way that no one can obviously see, but it does have an impact. I myself, butterfly tapping, you know, across the chest and just tapping across the chest for a number, you know, 30 seconds. To me, it gives you that, like you just described, the compassion, you know, in an instant. And it just is that, you know, that real hug. But what it does then to bring about regulation within the body. And I just ask them to find 30 seconds. I speak with executives all the time that are back-to-back meetings. They never, ever land where they need to be. So I ask them just to ground themselves, press their feet firmly into the ground, roll their shoulders back, you know, those raised shoulders all the time, and take a breath. In 15 seconds, they've landed in the room, virtual room, the real room, and that has an effect. And what I talk about all the time is trying to find buffers that suit you. How do you bring in buffers of cortisol? You know, what can you do to buffer cortisol? And I talk about oxytocin being really important. And that's the bonding hormone, the connection hormone. So I'm like, take the time, have a phone call, have lunch with someone. Don't eat it at your desk on your own. The power of connection in those instances. So it's about these inputs that can bring about regulation to your nervous system. And those are just some of the practices that I really try to, again, I can feel it in my body already. You know, you're after a really stressful day, and whether you're at home working before you close that laptop and you go face into your family, you want to bring the best version of you. For years, I was reactive and snappy, and, you know, I still have to check myself at times, you know, and that breath in the moment before you go into your next stage of your day is really powerful. You know, if you're in a car, just take a moment to breathe and you will turn up into a different person. And fear is sensed all the time. So if you're in that fearful state, you know, something at work that you're worried about, that's bringing out fear, and the family will feel that. And all of a sudden you've got this unknown tension in the air that shouldn't and doesn't have to be there.
Yeah. Yeah, very well said. It's it's about finding these practices. They're different for everybody, and everyone will have a different routine and different amount of space that they can give to these regulation practices. But for me, they're the most important thing we do. Like you said, it used to be the case of a packed calendar filled with calls was seen like a sign of success. You know, when actually all that does is it just keeps you in this cycle of overwhelm. And then when you do, you know, go sit down to do your work, you're creating from overwhelm, and you just create more of the same energy. The energy you put into your work means you get the same energy out of your work. So if you're always creating from that place of under-resourced and overwhelmed, then you tend to be like the hamster on the wheel, working very hard but not actually making any progress. Whereas if you can, and this is where boundaries come in, it's not a sign of great success if you're sat on Zoom all day. You're much better to put some boundaries in place and realize, okay, am I needed in that meeting? Is this meeting going to move me forward? No. Okay, can I check out of that one? Instead of going to another meeting, can I actually go for a walk around the block, like you said, or just sit for a moment, like I showed earlier, just feeling to what's happening within my body, taking a few mindful breaths. And then what I like to do at the end of the day is practice what I call energetic hygiene, sitting with a member of my community to offer support and presence. And we just sit for 10 minutes and we feel through what's happening within our bodies. We're not trying to make anything happening. We're not make anything happen or achieve a certain state. It's just, can I just feel through all these repressed emotions in my body with support? And the support is so important, because if you ever try to meditate on your own, what tends to happen is the mind doesn't feel safe. And so it kind of takes over and takes you off to the past or the future. you've got someone sat with you who can offer grounded support and presence, the system can relax, and it's much easier to sit with what's coming up in the body. And that gives me that buffer that you talked about between work and family time. So I can process all of that stress that's built up during the day, so I can be more present and aligned for the relationships that really matter that I step into in the evening. So you've got to find, practice that work for you. But I'm always saying, like, really, if there's nothing more important than that, because, it's working from a place of overwhelm. You're going to keep getting the same results over and over again. It's going to eventually show up in your relationships, both with yourself and those around you. And that's what's most important in life, ultimately. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for joining, Sinead. Anything else you'd like to share? Anywhere you'd like to point people to if they'd like to learn more about you and what you offer?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you today, Mark. Could be here for the day in regards to all of this. So most of my work, I do a lot on LinkedIn. So you can follow me on LinkedIn, which you can provide you the link for your followers to click into.
Yeah, I'll put it in the
awesome.
about section below.
But, for me, I just keep really and truly, my message to everyone is that this is a language. And once you understand what the language is, things can change. It's not a personality flaw. It's not a character flaw. It's literally just your biology trying to protect you. And when you can tune into it and adapt to what it needs, it just changes everything. And it's absolutely trainable, teachable. And that's the exciting bit that I can't wait to continue to share the message with them.
Beautiful. Yeah, as you said, it's ultimately any repeating pattern in life, anywhere we feel stuck externally in our work or our life or relationships, is reflecting something internally that is stuck or, is needing our presence and awareness. When you get that the external is just a mirror for the internal, then you've got the key really to moving through any situation with the least amount of friction and suffering as possible. Beautiful. Thank you so much today, Sinead. I'll let you go here. As I say, links to Sinead's LinkedIn below. And yes, I'll be back soon. So thank you for watching.